The light afforded him from the car and the comforting rumble of the engine turned off as he reached the tree line. He had told Debbie not to draw attention to the car, to be quiet and dark, but he regretted it now. He also regretted not bringing a torch with him, but in the panic of escaping the video shop, it was no wonder. Mr. Henty was no prepper. He wasn't prepared for any of this, not even aware of the lengths he would go to for his wife. It was dark, but the purple vines wrapped around the trees and lurking on the ground in nests ready to trip you had a certain glow about them, enough to lead him where he wanted to go. Thorns scratched at his clothes and he wondered if they had broken the skin, aware since reading Twinge's litany what that would mean, but he was not afraid of that. He was afraid of the lakes and what dwelled beneath them. He reached wet ground before he expected to, at first just a squelching sound and slipping feeling, but soon a sinking, his shoes filling. The lakes should have been further out, but the storm had flooded the park and brought them closer. In the distance, a tiny light was flickering, and he stared into the darkness until his eyes adjusted and he saw it. He had seen it before, in the book, in his dreams, in the blacks of his wife's eyes, but to see it now was different. An uncanny, festering dread washed over him and crept inside. A car was stuck in the mud, and Mr. Henty had to wade around it to reach the church. The flickering in the distance was growing, and he could make out where the door was now. Wading turned into swimming, and he blocked out the images of sunken bodies that assaulted his mind. He felt the occasional hand wrap around his ankle, but they didn't hold him. He reached the open doorway and had to pull himself inside, scrambling on the wooden floor to get his footing. The diagonal angle of the room was disorienting, the aisle more to his shoulder than in front of him, and yet the congregation sat firmly in their seats. He had interrupted a hymn, and the low, seductive echo travelled around the room as they fell silent. The candles flickered in an absent wind, and Cecily turned to face him. Her black hair and gown drenched and hanging, dripping onto the floor around her. He knew that she had swum to the church like he had, imagined her scrambling through the doorway moments before he did, and yet she looked like a part of the woodwork, etched into the bones. "Have you come to worship, Tulip?" She exhaled in a breath she quickly sucked back in. Her eyes were so wide they bulged, and her arms and hands were littered with scratches from the poisonous thorns. "I've come to see," he replied, looking at the faces of the silent people. They were hollow, puppets on strings for something else, something he could feel was watching. "Then see you will. The whole town has come to celebrate his birth." Cecily looked around at grey faces of waterlogged victims and smiled, her arms outstretched as if to welcome them. "These people are dead. Whatever it is you think is coming, it's worshipping itself. This is a sick performance for something even sicker than you." He knocked a candle over and it lit a small circle of the wood before snuffing itself out. "Are you even sure we're still above the surface?" she laughed. "Perhaps he's swallowed us up already and we're safe inside him." "Do you have so little to lose?" asked Mr. Henty, trying to appear calm but all the while processing elaborate plans of destruction in his mind. He was sure whatever it was, the root of this chaos and turmoil in Avis, it was here in this church, in this opposite of a church. No, poor man, it's what I have to gain. The grey bird, the litany, it's beautiful. I heard it once and I'd give my life to hear it again. Did you give your life or someone else's?" She grimaced and let out a laugh completely void of joy, turning back to face the stained glass windows at the end of the aisle. Beautiful mosaics depicted religious scenes Mr. Henty was familiar with. Adam and Eve, the birth of Christ, the execution, but in all of them something was off. Something else was present, something hard to see. "What is the litany?" Cecily turned back to him again, her wide eyes lit up in psychotic glee. "I don't think it's for you," she sneered. "But since you're here anyway, just wait and see." Some of the people he had arranged to meet that night were sitting in the pews. The woman he had met in the park, hoping somehow she'd have answers, now stared blankly towards the front of the aisle. Cecily dragged him back from distraction by breaking her wrist on the lectern. It cracked loudly and crunched as she let it dangle at her side, fingers twitching senselessly. She used her other hand to scratch at the opposite shoulder, blood collecting under her nails. The floor shifted again from under his feet and he steadied himself with his hand on the ground. "You'll never keep your head up that way, Tulip. You need to dance with it, swinging in the birdcage, hanging like a lark." He noticed the carvings now, strange shapes and words scratched into the wooden floorboards. Names and sigils, some symbols he recognised from movies that had witches in them, some symbols that looked older than his mind could comprehend, and words, not in English or any other language he knew of. Cecily broke her other wrist on the crucifix and smudged her blood into the gold. "Traveller beware," he murmured to himself as his mind ran wild with poems and nursery rhymes, sayings from the town, artefacts from the museum. Birdcage, a shelter for birds with secrets to keep. Cecily swayed back and forth in a seemingly relaxed dance, her wet hair spraying droplets of water and blood across the walls with every flip of her head. "Are you going on about that poet, Tulip? He went mad and died, his wife, I think his children too. Good, poetry is boring. He only came here once and it destroyed him, but it didn't follow him. This thing, your king, it didn't leave Avis because it can't leave Avis. Proximity. Twinge said it, we just have to get away from it." "It's a bit late for that, dear." "It's in here, isn't it? It's under the floor." "If he was under the floor, I would have clawed him out by now." No, it isn't coming and we need to escape. It's coming because we're here, because we're..." He looked at her and finally saw what she really was. He saw the Baileys and Debbie's mother and finished his sentence. Suffering. Cold sweat and prickling goosebumps poured over his skin as he tried to stand up. He felt a weight around his neck pulling him towards the cursed wood. He felt choked, as if he was drowning. The floor moved beneath his feet and the air got thick. Cecily started to drift up towards the ceiling, her hair and clothes fluttering away from her body as if on a wave, her blood seeping into the room around them. The church was submerged. There was a sound travelling through the water, a melody. Mr. Henty pulled himself into one of the pews, brushed past the corpses floating out of their seats and dragged himself towards the door. He lost sight of it before he reached it, but even in the darkness, and deafened by that song, he made contact with the wooden frame and pulled himself through. The darkness was eternal. At least it felt it, and he thought he had died until he broke the surface of the weeping lakes and gasped for air. It was loud, the splashing and gasping until he calmed down and suddenly it was silent. There were no birds in the forest. There had never been any birds in the forest of Avis. No nature of all besides this thing and all its different faces. A scream broke the silence, followed by incoherent yelling and an engine failing to start. It wasn't his car, no, too far away. It was the abandoned car, floating in the near distance, interior lights flashing on and off and on again. He started swimming towards the car, the rain picking up again and drowning out the sound. As he got closer, he made out the shape of a girl crawling on the bonnet and reaching one broken and dangling arm into the sunroof. "Get the fuck off of my car!" yelled Debbie as she climbed out, sinking waist deep into the water and drawing the attention of the twisted girl. Mr. Henty reached the door and peered inside to see Shannon and Mary quivering away from him. He started to push the car, which moved with ease in the deep water. He could hear Debbie tussling with that thing in the dark, splashing and screaming, but he ignored it. He felt at any moment the ground might fall out from underneath his feet and drag them all back into the darkness. The front wheels finally hit solid ground and he dug his heels into the wet earth to push it onto the bank. It was heavy and the water seemed to be pulling into the centre of the lake. The force of pushing was forcing his feet deeper into the mud and he felt his ankles sinking. "Come on!" He grit his teeth and pushed again. This time the engine burst into action as Debbie came up beside him and pushed too. The car mounted the muddy forest floor and Mr. Henty climbed into the driver's seat as Debbie squeezed into the back. "Thank God!" cried Shannon, as they peeled away from the lake and back onto the road. Mr. Henty thought it best not to ask as they drove past his destroyed car, blood and shattered glass surrounding its devastation. They were quiet for the entire drive to Whitney, just the soft sobbing of Shannon and occasional humming of Mrs. Henty. The storm never eased, and they passed by many crumpled bodies on the road. As they reached the border of Whitney, they looked around for more refugees from Avis, but none were there. John Henty, Mary Henty, Debbie Dundee, and Shannon Bailey were the only survivors from what the newspaper would call a catastrophic weather event. "What happened in the lake?" asked Debbie as the EMTs loaded Mrs. Henty and Shannon into the same ambulance. "I don't know." "Will they come out? Follow us to Whitney?" "No. Their king is in Avis."